Speaking to you today is Dr. Barbara Forman. She is currently a professor of educational psychology at the University of Houston, where she teaches courses on psychology of reading, psycholinguistics, and assessment. She received her doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Foorman is principal investigator of a large 5-year grant funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to investigate early reading interventions. She serves as a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on the prevention of reading difficulties in young children. Soon her new basal spelling program will be released with her co-author, Louisa Cook-Moats.
The National Institute of Child Health and Human Development has been concerned about a national health problem, which is children's failure to learn to read. It's not so much that we are worse off, that more children in fact aren't learning to read, but our literacy expectations are higher in a computer literate environment. 5th grade literacy is no longer acceptable. High school level skills are what are demanded in the workplace. So this is regarded as a national health issue. The children in this school district are roughly a quarter Asian, a quarter white, a quarter Hispanic, a quarter African American. We were measuring the growth in phonological awareness and some of the other constructs that you saw. What you see is the line, it starts out dipping a little bit lower and then rises above the other line about mid-year. This is the growth in the phonological analysis factor of the children in the experimental kindergarten. After Christmas, when the games, the Lumberg games, get to the phoneme level, the children in the experimental curriculum had a faster rate of improvement and a faster end-of-year score in the analysis factor compared to the control group. We are using scores on the receptive and expressive syntax as a covariate, and we're also using ethnicity contrast. There are no ethnicity differences in this analysis, but there were at the beginning of the year. It's important. What a happy consequence of having a phonological awareness curriculum is that you eliminate baseline ethnicity differences that we've seen in every one of our studies. Houston has a lot of different dialects and languages. Part of what you're doing in phonemic awareness is agreeing or negotiating the representation of phonemes that may be very different in one person's dialect of English compared to another. In Houston, P-E-N and P-I-N are not phonemically different in their pronunciations. For me, they are in my Midwestern dialect. It's quite interesting to observe different dialect issues instructionally. Our monitoring data is full of different representations of phonemes, and the teachers who are most successful are sensitive to their children's representation of phonemes. They're sensitive to their own dialect and to the dialect of their children. In this particular study I'm going to tell you about, there are 375 first and second graders. They were in 8 different schools. They're primarily an African American sample, 58%, 20% Hispanic, 20% white, and a few Asian. There were 58 classroom teachers. This district was a leader in Houston in whole language approaches. And during the middle of this study, the district became a leader in contextualized phonics, embedded phonics approaches at the demands of the school district to use phonics. So contextualized phonics seemed to be a good approach. The curriculum that WL for whole language, EP for embedded phonics, and DI for direct instruction. So the district was about 90% whole language instruction. They were shifting towards the embedded phonics or contextualized phonics approach in the middle of as our study began. And we introduced a direct instruction approach that they were already using in math and were quite comfortable using in reading as well. Our study design was, we were interested in the early interventions for children receiving Chapter 1 tutorials. And one question that had never been addressed was, should that tutorial match the classroom instruction, or should it be something very different? This district was about to embark on reading recovery training, and they had something based on Marie Clay's principles that they called reading empowerment. So what we did was we had a tutorial that was based 30 minutes a day of each of those classroom curricula, the direct instruction, the embedded phonics, the whole language. And then we also had the district standard, which they called reading empowerment. And actually the children in the whole language got reading empowerment, and half the children in the other two phonics programs got reading empowerment. So we were interested in that kind of nested design. Here are children who are in a tutorial. They're also in a classroom. Does it make sense to match that classroom method with your tutorial, or to do something different? Our measures were to look at growth in the phonological area, the orthographic area, word reading, and standardized outcome measures. My project director was one of the leaders in the area in whole language. She and her 21 teachers worked on a definition of whole language, but basically what it says on the top is carried out in short sentences here on the bottom of the page. That the components of this instruction would focus on classroom groups, and interactions in print-rich environments with the teacher as the facilitator rather than the director of learning. There would be read-alouds, shared, guided, independent reading. Response to literature was important. That writing, spelling, phonics were to be done in context. There would be learning centers and curriculum integration and portfolio assessment. The embedded phonics curriculum had an emphasis on phonemic awareness and word patterns. So it was really an onset rhyme emphasis. The onset is the beginning phoneme, the rhyme is the medial vowel, and the remaining consonants. Teachers understand the rhyme as a word family approach, but as has been said earlier, the word families don't necessarily generalize. You have to remember to manipulate the front end of the word too, the onset. The district put a lot of money and time into developing a curriculum guide, teacher's guide for this approach, and all of the trade books in the libraries were indexed with respect to the word family that was to be taught. The word families were obtained from the St. Vrain Valley School District outside of Boulder, Colorado, where they had used this program for quite some time. So we had a sequence of word families from Colorado, and then our district created this rich guide about this thick with all the trade books indexed, so the teacher could go to her library and pull out a trade book that had that particular target spelling pattern in it. Then the idea was that during the reading of a big book or a trade book, that the target pattern for the day would be highlighted and a lesson would be made around that target pattern. The class would extend the pattern in this mini lesson, but then throughout the day in their reading language arts activities, they would extend the use of this pattern. Small group activities would also reinforce work on this pattern, and children who needed extra help would be worked with individually or in small groups by the teacher. The direct instruction approach that we used was not just any approach. We were looking for a program, though, that reflected current thinking about explicit systematic instruction in the alphabetic principle, moving it into connected text reading as soon as possible to provide a balanced approach. I've been told the word direct instruction is a bad word in California. In Texas, I can't get away without using it. Every time I use explicit instruction, they say, "Oh, you mean direct instruction?" I said, "Well, not exactly necessarily. Montessori can also be very explicit, because this notion of direct instruction as one teacher with a whole classroom of kids is not necessarily what I mean when I'm talking about the explicit systematic instruction of a principle in a curriculum. The components of this program are that in the first 30 lessons you have phonemic awareness, then you have phonics lessons from lessons 11 to 30, focusing on the basic 42 sound spelling patterns. There are phonics programs that go up to 78 or even more. This is a minimal number of high utility phonics rules. Blending is a key strategy. There are little books to practice the sound spelling pattern that's being taught, so that's the decodable text is provided. There's dictation. There's shared reading of big books. Then by mid-first grade, you're starting to read text anthologies. I've heard people say this program is too hard for Title I children. Well, the second graders in this study had to start with first grade materials because they couldn't read. The first graders in this Title I started with these materials and made wonderful progress, as you'll see. But I think the answer to that question is it depends on when you start them with this program. As I said, each tutorial matched the classroom method. So there was a direct instruction tutorial, embedded phonics tutorial, and then I've put up a slide of the reading empowerment tutorial just because, so you can see that that was essentially based on the idea of the reading recovery lesson cycle, although it wasn't until the following year that their teacher came back from training. This is an innovated design for this study. We're trying to be responsive to the fact that children grow at individual rates. We're not just looking at a pre-test, post-test design, which is what educational method studies have typically done. In individual growth curve methodology, we have growth curves of each child in this study, 375 growth curves. If I put them up here, you'd cry. It's too many to look at once. So we put mean instructional group, but you first analyze at the individual level to look at the general pattern of the data across time. Our assessments are done 4 times across the year, so we can measure individual growth. The growth tends to be linear in these young children. They're making rapid change by and large. This is the phonological awareness growth. At the beginning of the year, there were no significant differences in the instructional methods, in the instructional groups. They all started out at the same very low level on the district's emergent literacy survey, which is based on Mari Clay's concepts of print. And that's why they were receiving Title I services. These lines are, in fact, different at the end of the year between the direct instruction group and the whole language research group. There were 2 whole language groups. One was the research group that we saw and that we trained. Then there was the district control that was trained in the usual way that the district did their summer in-service and their supervision. The plot you see on the screen, the phonological awareness growth, confirms that this direct instruction program, which directly taught phonemic awareness, indeed had its children performing the phonemic awareness tasks at a better level at the end of the year compared to the whole language children. I'll add that right now we don't know if that is true of all direct instruction programs or only this one. So in our current research, we're actually manipulating phonemic awareness in several direct instruction programs: Bob Slavin, Success for All, SRA Reading Mastery, and the literature-based kindergarten basal in the district. The next slide shows the word reading. And the word reading, this is from our word list that we use that is 50 words of first grade through 3rd grade level of difficulty matched for frequency and consistency and representative of the rich orthographic domain of English. Thank you, Louisa Motes, for giving me ideas about how to do that well. And such word lists are very easy for districts to develop and use for this kind of continual assessment of children's progress. What we found on the word reading is that the direct instruction group was significantly outperforming the whole language group in the slope, which is the rate of improvement, and the final April performance. And that in the April performance, the direct instruction group was significantly outperforming the embedded phonics group. The next picture is a rather unsettling picture. It's a histogram of the growth estimates, growth curve estimates, the rate of progress that children made in word reading in each of these instructional groups. In the top left-hand quadrant, you have the whole language research train, the group that we trained. Below that, the standard district whole language. The top right, the direct instruction. The bottom right, the embedded phonics. What you see is a skew towards the left, which is a column of 2.5 words or less learned over the entire instructional year. And you see that 33% of the research whole language, 34% of the standard whole language, 25% of the embedded phonics children were learning less than 2.5 words per year across time. The direct instruction, on the other hand, was 6% were learning less than 2.5 words. And the direct instruction gives you the kind of normal distribution that you would expect. Some children are learning quite fast and other children not so fast, but it's more normally distributed as you would predict. This data is so skewed, we actually did logistic regression. You have a the children in the direct instruction group are 6 times more likely to be reading more than 1 word at the end of the year than the whole language children. If the criteria is 2 words read accurately at the end of the year, then 85% of the direct instruction children were successful compared to only 52% of the whole language children. These are Title I children. It's not hard to see why there are whole schools in Houston ISD that have children who are failing in reading. But it's also possible to see that that can be changed by classroom instruction. The interesting thing is that the tutorial did not have a significant impact above and beyond the classroom method. The rate of growth, the correlation between the rate of growth in word reading in the tutorial and time in the tutorial was only 0.16. The children made progress, but mostly they kept from falling behind. Maybe it's the way to look at the tutorial. But the classroom method is what made the big impact. The name of our grant is Early Interventions for Children with Reading Difficulties or at risk for reading difficulties. What I've learned is prevention is where we need to put our money, and then intervene one-on-one with those children who will need it, but use your money wisely first for preventing the problem from ever occurring. It was interesting, too, that the type of tutorial did not make a difference, and this is supported by my other NIH researchers. When you get to the one-on-one level, which is better than any other ratio, the method doesn't make as much difference because the teacher is giving immediate feedback to the child. That is why. The method seems to make the difference at the classroom level. Well, these are the standardized percentiles that everybody likes to see, but in our growth curve methodology, we consider these just descriptive. But they're impressive. There's a group, the direct instruction group is getting to close to national average on the basic and broad reading from the Woodcock-Johnson. The basic is a decoding measure. The broad has passage comprehension in it. There are significant differences between the direct instruction and embedded phonics and the direct instruction and the whole language groups. The whole language standard group is certainly in deep trouble. That's performance level is indicative of, well, it's the usual diagnostic criteria for a reading disability is performance below the 25th percentile. In spelling, the direct instruction group is also outperforming, although not at the same high level, which suggests that a spelling program might also be a good approach with these children. The formal reading inventory, at the bottom of the transparency, there are long text passages. It's in our normative data, we see that by second grade, end of second grade, we start to see performance on text passages, and that with very beginning readers, the shorter sentence kind of comprehension is better psychometrically because you have more variability. You don't have a floor effect, which is what you're seeing there. And in fact, the only significance in that text comprehension is the tutorial did make a difference for the children in the whole language instruction. It helped them marginally, but with a floor effect, you can't generalize very well from your statistics. What I do want to show you on the next transparency is leading into now how you can do your own monitoring in your classroom. The correlations between beginning decoding and comprehension are amazingly strong. This is from the longest longitudinal study in the United States, the Connecticut longitudinal study. You're looking at correlations between first grade decoding, and at the bottom, that 0.52, that's the correlation with ninth grade comprehension. The same children over that amount of time using the Woodcock-Johnson, which is about the only test you can use to do this kind of analysis because the Roche scaling allows you to have equal interval measurement. A correlation of 0.52 or 0.58 for the correlation with second grade decoding, ninth grade comprehension. You square it and you get the amount of explained variation. Close to 40% of comprehension in high school is explained by first grade decoding. Social science doesn't see strong relationships like that very often. I mean, nobody claimed that decoding is the same as comprehension. Comprehension involves memory and attentional problems that go way beyond decoding. But it still shows you the power of and predictive power of early decoding. On the next transparency, you see a growth curve from that same data. The top line are the normal readers in the Connecticut longitudinal study. The children, this is an epidemiological study of children selected from the whole state of Connecticut during, in one particular birth year. Those children were followed. Now they're at the end of high school. The top line shows you the typical quadratic learning curve of the normal developing readers, again using the Woodcock-Johnson. The two bottom lines are the lines of the readers with problems. The solid line is the reading discrepant group, the group that met the IQ achievement discrepancy approach. The dashed line are the low achievers, whose IQ isn't high enough to meet the discrepancy approach. Couple interesting things about this. First of all, once you're behind, you don't catch up. The notion of developmental lag is not, well, it's somewhat supported by this data because yes, there is a lag, but there isn't the catch-up that people hope for. So early intervention is a good idea because if you wait, it's not going to, the picture won't change. The other interesting thing is the use of the IQ test as a discrepancy marker is not supported by this data. These bottom two lines are essentially the same. They reach a plateau, as do the normal readers, but at a different level. But the two poor reader groups are not distinguishable from each other. We waste a lot of time and money doing IQ testing. We may want to do that for certain issues about mental retardation, but in terms of reading disabilities, we could use our money better to focus on early interventions and prevention. And finally, well, from our Houston ISD peer reading report, we summarized the basic a consensus view about a balanced approach to reading. I'm sharing this with you because this was a group of 20 very diverse thinking people. In our first meeting, I thought we'd never see anything in common. And we came up with this list at the end of about a 40-day work period. The phonological awareness and letter sound knowledge was very important. Explicit instruction in the alphabetic principle, with ample opportunity to practice the principle being taught through controlled vocabulary text and feedback on word pronunciations. Explicit instruction in orthographic conventions, spelling, morphology, and writing conventions. Number 4, explicit instruction in comprehension monitoring strategies as decoding becomes automatized. And ample opportunities to practice reading. So we extended the reading instruction throughout the day in the Houston ISD. The final transparency, Louisa, the final transparency. I believe you have this table in your packet. It's a beginning way to think about assessment. It's the way that we have conceptualized it, but we also think this could be brought into the classroom. The expressive and receptive syntax and vocabulary are marked with, in parentheses, not because they're not important, but they may not be relevant to all children. But if there is a child with an expressive and receptive syntax problem, the teacher might be worried about a language disorder and should certainly get an evaluation for that. The vocabulary issue is very important to ESL children and bilingual children, and that growth in the native language is vitally important. And the growth in the second language vocabulary is also critically important. And in Houston ISD, where over 50% of the children are Hispanic, the transition to English instruction only is really rough if there hasn't been some development of English vocabulary along the way. The phonological awareness strand, someone asked a question earlier about how you might split this out into component parts. Well, this is an attempt to do that, mostly informed by our research that shows what children are more successful with earlier on. I would urge you not to jump into phoneme segmentation too early. I would urge you not to rush to identify kindergartners without first giving them a fun curriculum in phonological awareness, because you'll over-identify minorities. With a good curriculum, you'll eliminate ethnicity differences. The alphabetic principle and orthographic awareness can all be part of the same word list. And the issue of timing that word list is relevant to the notion of automaticity. What we do is our children read a word list untimed, and then we also have a timed list. Jean Osborne just told me that in the recent NAEP data, fourth grade NAEP data, that oral fluency was the most predictive measure of reading comprehension on the fourth grade NAEP. Now, what needs to be studied is also the single word time decoding and its relationship to the connected text fluency. We need more research on this. Because there's a lot of subjectivity to doing oral reading, miscue analysis, and the GORT, for example, the gray oral, its psychometric properties are not 100% wonderful. It's the best available to us in that arena, but we still need a little more research in this area. And finally, the comprehension text passages may not predict performance on real classroom comprehension, because there are so many confounding variables in measuring comprehension. Just give you that as a warning. Comprehension is the goal of reading. How to measure it is a conundrum for researchers, however. Should it be a closed test? And if it's going to be a closed test, then we don't have to depend so much on prior knowledge. But if you're not going to depend on prior knowledge, is that really relevant to the real world act of reading? Are you going to have an oral response or a written response, a timed response or an untimed response? Should the questions that you ask of the passage be factual or inferential, detail-oriented, general, or all of those things? Those are some of the challenges confronting researchers with how to measure comprehension. And we're working on that. It's very important. But the idea is that you can do some of this, if not all of this, evaluation in your own classroom. And it's a very important thing to help your teachers learn to do, because it's only by becoming reflective of our practice and having data on which to base our judgments about program effectiveness are we really going to change reading. Thank you.